Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel Hegland, and I am the Program Associate of the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at UWM. Today, we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Anneeth Kaur Hundle join us. Dr. Hundle is an Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Dhan Sahota, Presidential Chair of Sikh Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She will present an overview of her forthcoming book manuscript, Insecurities of Expulsion, Afro-Asian Citizenship Formations, and Global Uganda. And we are going to follow her presentation with a Q&A discussion led by Jacqueline Kurungi. Jacqueline is from Uganda and is in her third year of doctoral studies at UWM. She is also the president of the student organization Africology Now, and which is sponsoring today's event. So Dr. Hundle, we are delighted to have you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to get my timer going so I can keep track of time. So I wanted to greet everybody. Good morning. In Luganda, we say wasuz otia, osibia otia. So it's good morning and good afternoon, probably in Wisconsin, but it's morning still here in California. So I want to thank the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies program at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and especially Jacqueline Kurungi for extending this invitation to me. We work together at Makerere University in Uganda, so it's great to connect here in the US. And I also want to thank Rachel Hegland for assisting me with all the logistical issues. And I'm glad that we were able to sort out a way to do this event online, although I wish that I had been able to be here in person and to be able to meet folks in the department, colleagues and students, and especially to talk with students about their work. So I'm going to start now. I will do the screen share, and there may be some moments where I can take it off screen share, but you should be able to see me while I'm talking, and you can adjust Zoom if that helps you to be able to see me while looking at the PowerPoint slides. But what I want to do is I'm going to take us back to sort of 2008 in Kampala, Uganda, around the time I was beginning a phase of this research that emerges from my book project. An entourage of Indian officials and industrialists accompanied Narendra Modi at the time, the chief minister of Gujarat, to Kampala to meet the Ugandan Gujarati diaspora and the Ugandan political elite. Using the language of South-South cooperation, Modi and his cadre of diplomats and businessmen advertised Vibrant Gujarat, an annual global summit and trade conference in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, to businessmen who attended the event. A Ugandan Asian and Indian Gujarati business elite, mostly men, welcomed Modi with formal speeches, cultural entertainment, and a special reception at the Indian Association headquarters in the city, located on a small plot of land that had been repossessed from the Ugandan government by Indian community leaders in the early 1990s. Gujarati ethnic nationalism, performed through the promotion of Gandhian piety, industriousness, and philanthropy among businessmen, was on full display. Community leaders celebrated the contributions of an abstract, trans-historical, and cultural notion of the Indian or Asian community in Uganda. These festivities culminated with a grand investment conference and networking dinner at a hotel and convention center built by a wealthy Ugandan Asian tycoon in a residential area in the outskirts of the city center. Ugandans of indigenous African and South Asian origin, alongside Indian entrepreneurs and migrant laborers who worked in their offices and companies, gathered at the luxury hotel on the shores of Lake Victoria. I attended the event with a colleague where we were welcomed at the entrance by patriotic fanfare and cultural dances. We took our seats inside the banquet hall and began to listen to welcoming remarks. The raucous calls of the Egyptian Hadada Ibis interrupted the drone of official and diplomatic speeches, one speech transitioning into another as we began to dine. The speeches celebrated Gujarati business achievements and the history, promises, and prospects of what was described as African-Indian relations. A community leader announced, "Today is a great day. We are now representing Gujarat in Uganda. But the history of Indians in this country goes back to the building of the railway." As the evening continued, I listened to the ways in which political officials described Uganda as a secure investment destination for new Indian entrepreneurs and businessmen. In their invocations of safety and security, they alluded to the infamous 1972 Asian expulsion during Idi Amin's military government in Uganda. And so this is just a quick picture of that refugee expulsion process, which I'll come to in a bit. Uganda was one epicenter among many in East Africa in the context of novel global South connectivities, including the formation of BRICS, a geopolitical bloc comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the 50th anniversary of the 1955 Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, which reestablished the principles of the Bandung Communique in the new Asian-African Strategic Partnership. In East Africa, the East African Community, or the EAC, a Pan-Africanist organization institutionalized in 1967 and disbanded in 1977, had also been reestablished in 2000 with principles of advancing trade and business among East African nations. From the perspective of political and economic pundits, the possibility of autonomy from Western aid and donor dependency, global debt bondage, and decades of failed structural adjustment programs, relief from indebtedness via Chinese and Indian capital and credit lines with little to no interest rates, and the possibilities for African autonomy via new engagements with Asia has had widespread appeal, including the advent of powerful Africa Rising discourses, all of which have compelled new forms of millennial capitalist accumulation and economic exchange across the global South. National development policies that made use of Indian and Chinese FDI were becoming an increasing component of the leadership strategy of Yoweri Museveni and the NRM, the National Resistance Movement. By the early 2000s, state visits and bilateral agreements between Uganda and India that promoted trade, education, historical connections, and cultural exchange had been cemented. Thus, over a 50-year time span, Idi Amin's well-known populist project of racial and economic nationalism, which was practiced in the form of an economic war against racially and culturally defined Asians as economic exploiters, culminating in their expulsion, had given way to nationalist and public celebrations of Ugandan Indian and Afro-Asian relations, a transcontinental set of processes, practices, actors, and institutions working to attract Indian investment in the nation, all aimed at fulfilling stated goals set forth at Ugandan independence. These goals included the creation of indigenous African entrepreneurship and a modern, prosperous, developed, and educated Ugandan citizenry in partnership with other nations of the global South. Citational references to South-South cooperation seem to stand in for the larger possibilities for cross-racial, cultural, and community understanding, and possibly reconciliation after expulsion, concealing historical and contemporary expressions of racial and class inequality. What had accounted for these tremendous shifts, and how might one study and understand them? What did they reveal about the changing nature of imperial and sub-imperial processes, late capitalism, and African Asian entanglements in this part of the world, and the structures that had produced them? Why had the possibilities for discussion on African Indian relationalities, including these more contemporary Afro-Asianisms, contracted to such a degree in the academy, much less in academic African studies or South Asian studies? These contradictions, illegibilities, and complexities, alongside an ethnographic study of the processes and practices of Ugandan Asian and New South Asian citizenship, were my main focus when I began my research. Currently, many Ugandans continue to struggle for democratization and development in the nation, seeking freedom from cyclical forms of state violence and brutal forms of militarization that have characterized its post-colonial history. Ugandans join a Pan-Africanist and global South landscape of political uprising and protest. We can think just now about the protests happening in Nigeria, the anti-SARS protests that just began, were in the news last week because of the killings of Nigerian civilians. Moreover, the rise of the BJP right-wing movements in 1980s and 1990s India, followed by the ascendancy of Modi and other rightist leaders, have revealed the ways in which neoliberal development policies and South-South cooperation have quickly mutated into a new cross-Indian oceanic landscape of neoliberal authoritarianism and the accumulation of capital among multiracial post-colonial elites. My work attends to the rise of these elites alongside the shifting dynamics of labor, migration, race, religion, gender, sexuality, and citizenship in this changing geopolitical context. I argue that we need more focused attention, robust methodologies, and analytics for assessing African Indian entanglements in contemporary East Africa, and from the vantage of what I frame as a global Uganda in particular, rather than romantic discourses of Afro-Asian solidarity or Indian Ocean, East African cosmopolitanisms, or even a dissatisfying Afro-pessimistic sense of post-colonial closure and uneasy silence surrounding racial tensions. In this study, I offer grounded ethnographic research on what I frame as Afro-Asian citizenship formations. The analytic of Afro-Asian citizenship formations allows us to work past the already staked onto-epistemological boundaries and designations of Africanness and Asianness and monolithic ethno-racial identity as produced by imperial racial governance, nationalisms, and scholarly academic disciplining. Secondly, my use of Afro-Asian citizenship formations provides an opening to the transcontinental making of Afro-Asian relationalities more broadly, highlighting the limitations of normative liberal citizenship, as well as methodological nationalisms and area studies approaches common to disciplinary constructions of African studies and South Asian diaspora studies. In doing so, I'm inspired by the work of scholars who have sought to make legible the global intimacies forged by deep, thick histories of Indian Ocean connection and imperialist endeavors, and expand upon research, scholarly, and theoretical directions in relation to what has been described as Afro-Asian worlds and Afro-Asian imaginaries. I focus specifically on transforming configurations of Ugandan and Indian statecraft, extra-state sovereignties and governance, migration and settlement, citizenship, community, and racialization. Finally, the Afro-Asian and Afro-Asian citizenship formations allows us to denaturalize Afro-Asianism, a concept that has historically signified cross-racial, cultural, national, and continental connection and solidarity, but has also been reconfigured in relation to late capitalist modernities in the global South. As a feminist scholar, I'm interested in the practice and politics of co-optation, neoliberal co-optation of Afro-Asianism, which I will come back to shortly. By refreshing our traditional frameworks of analysis in East Africa on race, class, nation, and citizenship, as well as the conventions of South Asia diaspora studies and its occlusion of race in Africa, I attend to the urgency of new field formations in an era of geopolitical South-South connection, advancing ethnographic approaches in the interconnected domains of East African studies, Indian Ocean studies, and what I frame as Global South Afro-Asian studies. So in this talk, I won't be able to focus on the entire breadth of my book project, but I will draw on some material from chapter 3 of the book. And so this slide just kind of shows the structure of my book and where this talk is sort of building from. After providing some historical context, I will map out the national resistance movement's reshaping of Asianness and Asian citizenship in Uganda. And I'll also discuss what I refer to in the book as transnational Afro-Asian governance and its relationship to emergent citizenship formations. Finally, I'll include some ethnographic material to examine how returning Ugandan Asians negotiate a contradictory urban experience of racial non-citizenship and new forms of Asian global recognition and inclusion. So moving forward, I'm going to compress a lot of historical context in this talk because I just don't have time to go over all of it, including very interesting political history in East Africa and in Uganda. But I want to point out a few contexts that I think are very important. And specifically, first I'll start with just the Indian Ocean context in relation to East Africa and contemporary Uganda. Historians of the Indian Ocean have emphasized the longue durée social, cultural, religious, political, and economic interactions among Indians, Arabs, and Africans via the medium of Dhow cultures and mercantile trade and commerce in the Indian Ocean. This scholarship examines an alternative world system that existed before the onset of European imperialism and the establishment of colonial polities, modern industrial capitalism and plantation societies, modern conceptions of race, and the dominance of the liberal, secular, national. I do want to point out that some of this new scholarship can lean towards a nostalgic romanticism for Indian Ocean cosmopolitanisms. It can also be India-centric rather than Africa-centric, and it often can erase the long-standing impact of the Indian Ocean slave trade for African diaspora communities in the Indian Ocean. However, I also think that this new research is really productive for helping us to imagine Afro-Asian futures and to consider the ways in which people cohabit with each other in difference as a kind of ethic and practice that we can think about that has characterized the Indian Ocean and East Africa for a very long time. The next context I want to talk about is, of course, the British Empire in the Indian Ocean realm, including the making of the Indian British Raj and the Ugandan and East African protectorates. So I'm interested in three key issues here, which I address in an earlier part of my book. First, historian Sugata Bose has characterized the Indian Ocean as an interregional area that is between the larger world system and particular regional formations like nation states. And he includes kind of the British Empire of the Indian Ocean within that kind of formulation. Secondly, historian Thomas Metcalfe in his book, Imperial Connections, India in the Indian Ocean World, has suggested that the British Raj can be understood as a sub-imperial presence in the Indian Ocean realm. Moving to Uganda studies, what we find is that the focus has primarily been on the British imperial making of the territory of colony or nation, often sidelining the transcontinental migrations, mobilities, and connections between Uganda and the South Asian subcontinent and across the Indian Ocean world. And I think those connections, those broader kind of mobilities and migrations are very much part of the lived realities of Indian diaspora communities that settled in colonial East Africa, but also very much part of the lived realities of Indigenous Africans as well. So my third intervention is to consider how Uganda studies scholarship has been strongly rooted in a Marxist tradition of world systems theory and its analysis of the making of colonial capitalism. This intellectual tradition tended to naturalize racial difference rather than engage in analysis of racial formation and racialization in the making of a colonial racial capitalist order in Uganda. While interventions in understanding racial and native rule emerged later on, race is often still conceptualized as a political identity or a cultural identity with less attention to the specific local, regional, and global racial formations and racialization processes that operate in relation to labor and capital in the colony and post-colony. I argue that the British established a system of colonial racialized capitalism in which Indians were primarily positioned as intermediary capitalists between Indigenous Africans and the British imperial metropole, as well as the fact that they were racialized as superior to Africans. And thus they were kind of pitted in this antagonistic relationship to each other. And we have to think about these two processes of labor and racialization in relation to each other and not as separate. So the next important context is the formal decolonization era, which roughly took place between the decades of the 1950s and 70s and encompassed anti-colonial nationalisms, independence, and nation building. The racially and economically privileged position of Indian elites, their urban middle class life and accumulation of material wealth in the Uganda protectorate became the subject of populist racial and class-based grievances by indigenous Ugandan anti-colonial nationalists, leading to the advent of racial nationalisms. Indian urban presence and Indian racial and caste consciousness and racial endogamy helped to further entrench racial antagonisms and tensions. Africans primarily viewed Indians as a collaborating class with the British and with elite Baganda chiefs and other elites in the colonial protectorate. However, an Indian anti-imperialist and anti-colonial nationalist consciousness emerging from agitation in British India was also beginning to circulate and consolidate across the Indian Ocean and East Africa, politicizing East African Asians who were becoming involved in political organizations like the East African Indian National Congress. In the Ugandan protectorate, anti-British sentiment among Indians emerged in the context of shared Afro-Asian anti-colonial struggles in nearby Kenya. These practices recognize the importance of Indians identifying with African nationalist interests in their struggle to create independent nations. Moreover, transnationally and across the Indian Ocean, a discourse of Afro-Asian solidarity and anti-colonial struggle and modernist nation-state building initiated at Bandung in 1955 and further elaborated through Nairobian Cold War non-alignment among third world nations, compelled Indian diplomats and politicians to pressure so-called overseas Indians in East Africa to identify with African nationalist interests by taking on national citizenship. Despite these expressions of Afro-Asian solidarity, Ugandan Asians were influenced by their British Indian imperial citizen subject status and consciousness, including Indians' ongoing political ties to their imperial motherland, Britain, and more distant ties to their ancestral motherland, India. In the run-up to independence, Indians as third or fourth generation subjects of the British Empire and who had legally defined British protected person status became divided among those who saw a future for themselves in Africa and claimed Ugandan national citizenship, and others who viewed themselves as imperial citizens, loyal to the civilizational, racial, and developmental imperatives of the British Empire, ultimately retaining their British citizenship or resettling in Britain at independence. Divided loyalties and national ambivalences were the subject of heated debates during this period, and they extended from East Africa to the Indian nation and to Great Britain or the United Kingdom. Post-colonial Africanization policies and other legislation was designed to curb new Indian migration, immigration, and naturalization as Ugandan citizens, and it betrayed a colonial legacy of regulating Indian presence in East Africa, as well as post-colonial leaders' designs to define citizenship according to racial logics of citizenship, or a Black African majoritarian citizenship defined by indigeneity or ethnicity. These political strategies compelled Indians to further hedge their bets and enhance their sense of political security across multiple homelands, leading to more indigenous African suspicion of Indians' nationalist loyalties. As Indians negotiated their options across multiple homelands interconnected by British Empire, Ugandan political leaders like Milton Obote and Idi Amin increasingly considered Indians in Uganda to be suspicious interlopers and outsiders and disloyal nationalist patriots. As we will see, anxieties surrounding nation building at independence continue to inform contemporary projects of Ugandan statecraft and governance, including contestations over whether race and nation are mutually exclusive or if national territories can be racially and culturally plural. The Obote UPC government was a key period of contestation over Indian citizenship, which included reformist Africanization policies to curb Indian immigration and employment in the state and private sector, including imposing trading restrictions on the Indian trading class. 1971 Idi Amin military government takeover of Uganda initially preserved Obote's system, but then rapidly turned into the more drastic labeling and targeting of all people of South Asian descent to be racialized as a homogeneous group of Asians despite their internal class, occupational, ethnic, and religious differences. Amin launched an economic war against Asians that began in 1971, which ultimately culminated in a shocking 90-day expulsion order by decree that began in October 1972. Over a 3-month period, almost the entire remaining South Asian population fled Uganda in an internationally orchestrated refugee relocation process. And it's estimated that about 50 to 55,000 people of South Asian descent left Uganda at this time. So there's much more to say about Idi Amin's Uganda, and there's a lot more research emerging on this period, which is really exciting. But I briefly note here that in the process of my research, I found that some individuals managed to remain in Uganda during the Amin period after the expulsion decree, despite the fact that their legal citizenship had pretty much been substantively invalid. They had some kind of documentation that allowed them to stay, but they were really racial and cultural non-citizens. So I think of them as being kind of racially excluded from substantive citizenship. And I refer to this as an era of racialized denizenship for those who managed to remain. And in the larger book project, I explored the Afro-Asian relationships, particularly masculinities, that were formed in this period. And there's also more to say about the expulsion event and the way that I think about it as a fundamental social rupture and an ongoing event in Uganda that is rendered kind of exceptional, but also understudied as an ongoing event that continues to have a lived presence in contemporary urban life and is related to a sense of unsettlement and insecurity for Ugandans of South Asian origin, but also maybe arguably indigenous origin as well. The event of expulsion is still something that's very contested in contemporary urban life in Uganda, and it's also something that's very difficult for people to talk about because of political repression. So I'm not going to be able to talk more about that now, but I want to mention 3 major assumptions or problems that I encountered when I was going through the scholarship on East Africa and Uganda in particular. First, I found that because of the expulsion, there's a kind of assumption that this event resulted in the complete, what Ali Mazrui called the de-Indianization of the nation, such that there's no need to study South Asian presence in Uganda, or that South Asian people are not still in Uganda, and that these relationships between indigenous Africans and South Asians don't persist. The second problem is that most scholars do not study race in Uganda or East Africa. They primarily focus on the ethnicity paradigm. That's kind of starting to shift now as more scholars are working on race in Africa outside of South Africa, but it's still pretty rare to find, for example, anthropologists working on that in Uganda. And then finally, most assume that it's not important to study citizenship in so-called illiberal African countries, where there's a sense of African political formations as being weak, right, and not substantive. In my work, I try to upend these assumptions that emerge from kind of liberal orthodoxies, and I work to make both what I call Afro-Asian citizenship formations and Afro-Asian relationalities legible and significant and important to continue to center in how we study East Africa. And I can talk about that a little bit more too. So I'm now going to shift to the post-1990s context of Uganda and the return of diaspora Ugandan Asians who were expelled and new South Asian migration to the country. Again, I'm skipping over a lot of important political history, including the Liberation War fought by the National Resistance Army, which then became the national resistance movement, and the kinds of changes they put in place to attempt to undercut a pattern of ethnic violence in post-colonial Uganda. In the larger project, I traced the evolution of NRM governance and its relationship to a liberal international global order, examining the ways in which this order undermines the possibilities of decolonization. I focus in particular on the 80s and 1990s as key decades of structural adjustment reforms in Africa and in Uganda specifically, setting the stage for neoliberal economic liberalization and the further privatization of state entities. Oftentimes this was done under an explanatory rubric of stemming corruption. And what we know about corruption, of course, is the way that international finance and neoliberal globalization has expanded the possibilities for corruption on a domestic nation-state scale, but the discourse of corruption is something that is very strong in most mainstream social science analysis of Uganda. So using a number of innovations in anthropological theory, I examined the NRM as a neoliberal authoritarian developmental security state. I identify this period from 1986 to present as a key period for the remaking of Afro-Asian relationalities and emergent citizenship formations. In particular, I'm interested in the non-liberal domains of citizenship making that have emerged with renewed force in the NRM period, including the racialization of so-called Asians and the capitalization of citizenship. There are three key processes that made this possible. First, a large-scale property repossession process that took place in the mid-1990s. Second, the role of the sovereign as authorizer of Ugandan Asian and South Asian presence in the nation. And third, the advent of what I call transnational Afro-Asian governance, which has come to constitute South Asian inclusion in the nation these days. So first in the late 1980s and early 90s, and with the pressure and advice from international finance institutions, the NRM introduced the Expropriated Properties Act. They reintroduced it, actually. The government was successful in processing the paperwork of Ugandan Asian exiles and returning property and assets back to the original owners after the property had been taken away during the expulsion process. So I argue that property repossession for diaspora Ugandan Asians was not primarily a political process associated with cross-racial Afro-Asian reconciliation or political justice after expulsion, but primarily an economic process associated with the compensation for lost property and assets, but also a move to attract foreign capital to Uganda from its kind of exiled South Asian diaspora. Museveni began to travel to the Ugandan embassies of the adopted countries of expelled Ugandan Asians, particularly the UK and Canada, where he worked to formalize the property repossession process and identified and advertised areas of investment for returning family firms, so business families primarily. Several of these visits were coordinated alongside 25th anniversary Ugandan Asian expulsion commemorations. At a meeting with exiled Ugandan Asians in a Hindu temple in Neasden, England in 1997, Museveni assured exiles that the new constitutional framework of the NRM would ensure that property repossession would proceed successfully, that security of property and ownership would be protected, and that return on capital investments could be sent out of the nation. So the kind of neoliberal framework that we operate with today. In addition, he suggested that exiled Ugandan Asians should forget about what happened with the mean for Africans, as he described them, had also suffered under his rule. So this idea of kind of shared victimization by Idi Amin became really important. So these public discourses suggest important transformations in Afro-Asian relationalities during the early 90s. Property repossession was critical to the remaking of territorial claims to Uganda for exiled Ugandan Asians. So if one possessed their home or their business or property, that helped them to kind of claim a Ugandan heritage and Ugandan citizenship, right? Secondly, Afro-Asian relationalities were established on the basis of neoliberal capitalist logics. including the promise of security of property and personhood and the mobility of capital across national borders, accommodating transnationals who lived across Western liberal states in East Africa. Third, they were refashioned on the basis of the incorporation of ethno-racial outsiders by political sovereign that formalized a political culture of racial protection in exchange for personal state loyalty and obligation. Finally, diasporic return citizenship was defined on the basis of explicitly economic criteria that connected Ugandan Asian exiles to abstract notions of Asian capital, inaugurating new forms of economic citizenship for returnees. The NRM maintained, therefore, a kind of racially nativist citizenship project where citizenship is still sort of legally and substantively defined by ethnic indigeneity, African indigeneity, yet also developed an inclusionary economic citizenship for elite Ugandan Asian family firms and other returnees. Although formal citizenship laws were changed in the 1995 Constitution to allow expelled Ugandan Asians to reclaim national citizenship based on their multi-generational ties to Uganda, substantively, they were primarily defined as economic and not racial or cultural citizens. And I think that is the real important innovation of the Museveni government. Neoliberal and non-liberal strategies of national inclusion would become more important than liberal or legal juridical ones. So I'm trying to think about how citizenship changes in this kind of post-liberal sort of context, right? Many returnee individuals and families asserted that their return had been facilitated by President Museveni's invitation, what I describe as citizenship by invitation or permission, in which personal relationship, racialized protection and securitization, clientelism in some cases, and cross-racial heteropatriarchal solidarities become crucial to the possibilities of South Asian presence in the nation. Transnational, cross-racial, fraternal partnerships were expressed by male sovereigns across these countries in publicly staged performances of the reconciliation of Ugandan Indian ties on the basis of neoliberal capitalist national development. These public spectacles enabled embodied, affective, and symbolic ideological circulations of Afro-Asian affinities and exchanges, building on deeper histories of Afro-Asianism, but silencing and masking more recent histories of racial violence, mistrust, and expulsion. I use the analytics of Afro-Asian governance to describe the transnational assemblages by which configurations of actors, elites, institutions, and states use shared imperial and colonial histories of oppression, diplomatic performances, moral injunctions, development goals, affective and gendered encounters, and ethical incitements to forge and establish cross-racial political community, practice non-liberal strategies of citizenship, and extend projects of neoliberal Afro-Asianism. I theorize neoliberal Afro-Asianism as a technology of governance that extends neoliberal capitalist norms via Afro-Asian solidarity frameworks, masking local, historical, and contemporary configurations of inequality and hierarchy. In doing so, I expand the ways in which we think about Afro-Asianism as a political and cultural formation that emerged in relation to anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and anti-racist solidarity frameworks, but also Afro-Asianism as an emergent technology of governance that has enabled new projects of capital accumulation, citizenship making, and racialization in a global South geopolitical context. I already talked about Modi's visit to Uganda in 2008, but I wanted to add that in respect to the Indian nation, a number of bilateral, state level, and ministerial visits occurred during the late 1990s and 2000s, remaking these relationships between African nations and the Indian government. Most recently, the Vice President and now the Prime Minister of India, Modi, have visited Uganda in 2017 and 2018, with the latter visit culminating in the PM visiting the Ugandan parliament and addressing the Ugandan president, cabinet, and ministers in an hour-long speech on India-Uganda relations. And I don't think that has ever happened before in the history of Uganda, where the Indian Prime Minister has addressed the parliament in the Parliament House. Museveni and high-ranking ministers have also regularly attended a number of new forums and conferences in India in order to strengthen business ties and diplomatic and economic cooperation, including the India-Africa Forum, which began in 2008 and occurs every 3 years, Vibrant Gujarat, which I already started the talk with, which began in 2003 and is a biennial conference in Gujarat state, and also the CII Exim Bank Conclave India-Africa Project Partnership, which began in 2005, and it's an annual event. Indian ministers and business entrepreneurs have begun to attend investment conferences in East Africa, including conferences that are promoted by the East African community. The EAC has annual conferences in different East African nations, and also national investment promotion agencies. So little scholarship has examined foreign direct investment and state-funded development projects from India in Africa in relation to other arenas of political influence, suggesting powerful relations of verticality between India and African nations, rather than the horizontal nature of cross-racial solidarity and exchange. In Uganda, FDI and bilateral trade are typically measured by statistical indicators released by government agencies in both Uganda and India, while political contestation surrounding the success and the failures of investment projects in Uganda, discussions on Indian presence in the nation, Indian business practices, and Africanization debates are very common in the public sphere and in urban discourses, although that they have received less scholarly attention. High-level state, ministerial, and other diplomatic missions, including these transnational investment conferences, are very important research sites for examining what I'm calling Afro-Asian governance. It's successful precisely because of its reliance on historical practices of South-South cooperation and anti-Western anti-imperialist solidarity. It is Afro-Asian governance that has made possible the settlement of Ugandan Asian returnees, new Indian entrepreneurs, petty traders, and migrant laborers in post-colonial Uganda, such that they are defined by the state as investors. And in fact, I talk about in the book how I describe them as investor citizens, because most South Asians are now, the state defines them as investors, even though many Ugandans contest that claim and say, no, these are not investors. A lot of them are migrants or traders. Specifically, I argue that Afro-Asian governance has established contradictory forms of racial non-citizenship and racial inclusion, engendering new citizenship practices among racialized South Asians that are based on the calculation of racial risk and racial security in the nation. So in this last part of the talk, I'm going to shift gears slightly just to provide some examples of citizenship practices among East African Asians who are negotiating this ambivalent sense of racial inclusion and exclusion. I'll just stop the slideshow for a little bit. In the book chapter, I kind of focus on this group of people, unlike Indian entrepreneurs or community leaders or migrants. I kind of focus on this group of East African Asians or Ugandan Asians and what their apprehensions of this new context is. In the aftermath of the exoduses and expulsion in East Africa and their ensuing settlement in Western nations, many East African Asian families had become transnational, with branches of their extended families retaining or repossessing properties and developing businesses in East Africa. In some respects, we might understand the structural position of returnee Ugandan Asians to be similar to other Westerners who are racialized as white or Mzungu, and referred to as expatriates. Ugandan Asian returnees occupy these structurally white positions in relation to their citizenship and class privileges, participating in expatriate worlds. However, they're also racialized as Asian in the common sense of global racial hierarchies by the Ugandan state and everyday Ugandans. Reckoning with their previous experiences of racialized insecurity, they possess ambivalent citizen subjectivities connected to ongoing racial stereotyping as possible economic exploiters, disloyal nationalists, and inauthentic citizens. And they often state claims to patriotic national identity or cultural citizenship in order to counteract these assumptions about them or these perceptions about them. Transnational returnees generally often possess British, Canadian, or in some cases, US citizenship and passports. Some, but by far the minority, had retained their Ugandan or Kenyan passports. They often emphasized to me that it was important to have a plan in place in the event of future political instability, a discourse of insecurity in relation to a kind of impermanent sense of security that had become really a way of life. Among East African Punjabi Sikh communities, for example, these dispositions towards securitization required investing in multiple life trajectories and homelands, practices that resonated with feelings of racial and religious insecurity that had shaped post-colonial community histories in both East Africa and South Asia. East African Punjabis were quite practical in this regard. For example, Lal Singh, a Sikh community leader of the Singh Sabha Gurdwara in Kampala, was originally a Kenyan Asian with roots in Nakuru, who moved to Kampala in the early 1990s with his family to take advantage of expanding opportunities in the construction business. Meeting him in his office in the industrial area in Kampala one afternoon, we talked about the new landscape of Indian investment. Abruptly, he shifted the conversation to his apprehensions of Ugandans, who he racialized as urban Black Africans, what their opinions were of Asians in East Africa or in Uganda. Despite his use of reductive racial identifications and categories that were common in urban East Africa, he spoke very plainly. He said, well, they see us as not totally committed, not loyal. They don't trust us because we don't keep our eggs in one basket. Most Asians will keep their UK passports. In his discussion, historical tropes of the authentic versus the inauthentic Mwindi, or the Indian, or the nationalist versus imperialist loyalist were alive and present. He interpreted the unwillingness of Asians to take on legal citizenship and invest wholeheartedly in Uganda as the litmus test for political belonging in the nation, suggesting that Asians who were African in their hearts would risk their livelihoods and cast their lot with Africans and thus be true cultural citizens instead of taking advantage of their global citizenship privilege. At the same time, he was very proud of his own accomplishments and initiatives in Uganda, and he emphasized to me that his construction firm prioritized training and employing Ugandans rather than hiring possibly more skilled Kenyans that he had access to in Kenya. So I found that a lot of people kind of demonstrated their commitment to development and jobs training of Ugandans in order to authenticate their presence in the nation. Some Ugandan Asians stressed that they were Ugandan and had Ugandan passports rather than British ones. Practices of self-positioning in relation to legal juridical citizenship revealed the fraught historical relationships that many had with official documentation, such as passports, birth certificates, and permits and licenses. On a weekend drive from Entebbe to Kampala with Gurdeep, who was born in India, but who had lived his whole life in Uganda, including going to school in Uganda, his father had remained in the country during the Amin government, and he self-identified as a Ugandan of Indian origin. He excitedly took out his certificate of residency from his wallet, and he presented it to me. He had recently applied for it, and he was overjoyed that his application was approved. I don't really need it, he admitted, because everybody knows me around here, everybody, all Ugandans, but it's always a good idea to have it. He explained that in the event he was asked for this document by local police or military officials, he would prefer to have this document in addition to a copy of his passport. In many cases, Ugandans of South Asian descent with certificates of residency or even national citizenship were picked up by immigration police if they did not have a copy of their documents available or on them. And sometimes they were held at the police station. Gurdeep said it was embarrassing to be held at the police station with other common illegal Indian migrants, as he called them. He explained the necessity of small bribes to avoid these situations, as well as asking military or police officers to listen to the way that he talked. So he used linguistic markers like his East African accent to demonstrate his Ugandan identity. And a lot of this profiling is happening much more now in Uganda because of the global war on terror and also the racial profiling of Somalis in Uganda. And oftentimes Indians are being profiled more and more, especially because there are more undocumented Indian migrants who are arriving in East Africa. So I'm almost done. I just thought I would show, just let me pull up Zoom real quick. I'm just gonna move to my very last slide. That Jackie was asking me about earlier. Can everybody see that? Okay, so so I don't have time to delve more into talking about East African Asians and how they feel about Indian entrepreneurs and new migrants or even their Ugandan counterparts, but this material gives you a sense of some of the ongoing contestations surrounding citizenship, identity and belonging, contestation and anxiety that continues to characterize life in post-expulsion Uganda. Ultimately, I argue that the question of decolonization must be the central framework that we continue to operate from, especially given the limitations of liberal frameworks of citizenship in post-colonial contexts. However, I think that this requires thinking about broader internationalist and transnational frameworks to imagine solidarities and a much more serious intellectual undertaking of global South Afro-Asianisms, including attending to their co-optations. So some of the questions that I think we need to continue thinking about from the Ugandan and East African perspective, but probably in a global perspective as well, even if we think about some of the discussions that we're having in the US these days about decolonization and abolition. In the slide, I put up some possible issues. I mean, what do we make of the expulsion event? I characterize it in my book as a racially nativist expulsion. Was it a successful program of decolonization and nation building, or did it further entrench systems of coloniality, including race, even further within the post-colony? We can say race and racial capitalism in the post-colony. To what extent have the stated aims of the decolonization project, which was to de-racialize, de-nativize, de-ethnicize the nation from the colonial making of racial and ethnic identities, to what extent has that been achieved? And then also, to what extent has economic development been achieved within the current system? Another recurring issue in Uganda, cyclical forms of state violence. How do we make sense of the state form? Do we continue to work within the state form, or do we come up with another system altogether or abandon it? And then, the question that I'm really provoking in this book project, how do we decolonize citizenship? Is it about creating inclusive liberal citizenship, or is the question to decolonize the question of citizenship itself? And an ongoing complex question for me is, as privileged settlers and colonial subjects in the colonial and to some extent in the post-colonial period, what responsibilities and forms of accountability do South Asians have to Africa and to Africans? And vice versa, what responsibility do African governments have, for example, to maybe underprivileged or precarious Indian migrants that are in East Africa? Do they have any responsibility? And those are open-ended questions, and I think that we need much more research to kind of keep investigating them. And collaborative research, I think, is also very helpful and the way to go to start making progress on some of that. So I'll end there, and we should have plenty of time to talk. Sorry, I just saw that you couldn't see the questions fully. Should I show them again?
I think since you've gone through them, since you went through each question by each, so someone should at least be able to understand what questions you were posing, even some of the ends ones we are cut off. So thank you so much, Dr. Hundle, for the very insightful presentation. I like the ethnographic part of it because it gives us the gist of your slides to know. And I really liked, because I see even the way you're organizing your book project on organizing the book project around issues of relations of race, relations of racialized exile, relations of national recovery, relations of foreign direct investment. And it really tells me the framework of how you think about these things. You're kind of getting us away from the categories of race, nativism, and I feel like you're telling us to more look at what you're calling the citizenship formations, to look into how things are shaping, how things are forming, other than seeing ourselves as discrete people in this very connected world, which you're calling the geopolitical world. I really liked that. And it kind of threw away my questions because I was still going to ask the questions of what do we map race, color, gender onto all of this? But when you bring the question of relations, then all these things fall apart, because we begin to see that we are more than what we see, what we call the discrete categories, as if things are forming day by day. And then it takes me to this, perhaps what would be like, after those general comments, my first follow-up Q&A is, my question is, if you'd go on your slide, this slide 5, I think that last bullet, interesting, when you say race is not only a political identity, but an ongoing process of making difference. Yeah, and I'm like, is this a way of being? Is this problematic? Could you say more about that statement?
You just say that last part again? It just got a little fuzzy.
Race is not only a political identity, but an ongoing process of making difference. And I'm wondering, what exactly is in your mind when you say this statement? Is this a problem? Is this a way of being? Could you say more about that?
Yeah. So I'm hearing a little background noise from you, Jackie. You might want to mute a little bit. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for your question. I think this is really important. It was something that I was very stuck on for a while when I was working on my graduate work. I think race is an incredibly entrenched form in East Africa. Race is everywhere. It's, the air we breathe. It's everything that we swim in. And I'm reminded Professor Sylvia Tamale just did her talk on her book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, where she's deeply trying to, I haven't read the book yet, but from her talk, it sounds like she's deeply thinking about the entrenchment of these processes of coloniality, right? That colonialism is not just an episode in African history, but it is something that we can never we can never fully kind of depart from or divest from in an easy way, right? It's a deeply embedded form in East Africa, and particularly the logic of race is a deeply embedded form. I think a lot of times in the East African and particularly in Uganda studies scholarship, our the categories that we use can be quite prescriptive and quite abstract. So, for example, the idea of the citizen and the subject, right? We don't have a sense of, well, how do these citizens emerge? What is the process by which they are being formed? Or what is the process by which they are being excluded? Same with racial identity. I think we take race to be something very fixed and natural and essential, because race is so attached to kind of notions of phenotypic visual difference in the East African and actually the British imperial kind of context, right? The ways that Africans and Asians are defined is in such a strong way. There can be no kind of opening up of those categories. So I often found when I was dealing with the scholarship in Uganda was that race is considered oftentimes to be a cultural identity that people identify with, that they use in their everyday common sense to understand themselves and their community and other communities. Or it's often something that's taken to be politicized, right? And then it becomes a political identity. But we never talk about, for example, racialization as a process in East Africa. It's very difficult to talk about how does racial formation, coming kind of from the Omi and Wynot school of thinking, how does that actually work in the East African context? How do processes of racialization work? And are those processes of racialization local? What's local about them? What's regional or maybe Indian Ocean centric about those racialization processes? And then what are the global racialization processes that are at play? Likewise, there's like, different temporalities of racialization. So there's these, maybe deep imperial racialization processes, but then there's also these new contemporary racialization processes. So I talk about how, there's this constant construction of the notion of Asian. Well, Asian is not anything real. It's a category, right? And I think of it less as an essential marker, but as a political construction. It's a political formation. And it's something that is constantly being made and remade. So difference is being made and remade all the time. So what I was trying to demonstrate in my talk is that in this period of 1990s, when we saw the emergence of kind of neoliberal globalization and the uptake of that in African contexts, was that we saw that the notion of Asian was being reconstructed once more, and it was being racialized once more in relation to capital itself. So the notion of the Asian comes to exemplify abstract capital. It's like the Asian embodies capital itself. So Indians can only be in Uganda if they are investing in the nation and they're bringing capital to the nation, right? And that's the kind of issues and ambivalences that, for example, people who've been East African Asians who've been in East Africa for multiple generations are negotiating, that kind of contradictory inclusion and exclusion. So I would say that the space for a kind of more substantive decolonized citizenship has contracted even more, in the Museveni period and in this context of neoliberalism in the global South. It's very hard to participate in other forms of citizenship that are not linked to this kind of like investor identity. So we always have to kind of examine how our racialization process is working. In the book, I spend a lot of time thinking about the construct of the Asian and less of how Asians are constructing or thinking about or racializing Africans, but it's in the book. It's not the main thread because it's difficult to do both of that at the same time. But the key point is that both the notion of the African and the Asian are colonial inventions and constructions, but they're also very real to people because they have to negotiate these categories in their everyday lived experience. And they're also mobilized for important political and economic projects. For example, the ways in which I've talked about these changing discourses and practices of Afro-Asianism, right? So I don't completely do away with, I don't completely deconstruct African and Asian, but I also use them to remobilize, you know, what the Afro-Asian solidarity could be. But I also make a note that, you know, the Asian stands in and it erases and conceals all this complexity, right? There's like all these different ethnic and religious groups and linguistic groups, and same with the notion of Africanness, right? There's so much complexity there. And so I try to bring that complexity out in the book project. We still have to use the racial categories of the world that we live in, but we also have to always kind of denaturalize them as we're writing and talking about them. Because there's no other way to dismantle race itself, right? Race is a colonial project. Does that help?
It helps. It helps. It helps. I see the way you're trying to think through the things, because as you were talking, coming to America to study African and African diaspora studies, the question of race keeps hitting at me. And indeed, like you say, scholars in East Africa don't deal with the concept. If they deal with it, very few try to interrogate what exactly underlies the concept. And so that's something I keep falling in and out all the time as I'm writing, as I'm trying to understand African American racial questions here, which are really, like what you've said, there are those categories that we have made that we live and live out sometimes, and we are stuck with sometimes. But as you talk still, I feel like we scholars or people in academia, so much as we write makes sense to us. And indeed, when you think through it, it's really important, like what you're saying, questions of racism and how and the racial categories and how they're becoming complex to deal with over and over. Then my next question in that line would be, how do we speak to people in government? How have you tried to speak to community in relation to your project, such that they not only live by these categories, which actually are just constructs through different political systems, and which leave us with the problems that we deal with through the generations, but we discover that at least much as scholars try to struggle with these issues, I don't see, or I might need to know from you, how do you speak to the people in authority, to the community, so that what you're seeing gets to them, so that perhaps we don't know, over time, they may begin also to think through the way they think through issues. Like we are here in America, and you come here as an African with all the process you go through to be here, you think you're legally here, but over time you hit back by these questions of you think you may not be legal, you may not be actually supposed to be here, and you think like you begin asking yourself, what have I not done right not to be here? And as you're presenting about African Ugandan Asians in Uganda, this I think is what also it hits them when they're in Uganda and they're asked why you're here, when they actually have done a lot to be there, and they have been there by the legal systems that allowed them to be there, but because of these categories, they're in contradictions. So I request to hear from you. How do you speak to the public? How do you speak to the community on what has come what has come through your project?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Jackie. That's really great comment, and I can imagine that it's really interesting to think about how these issues play out in different contexts. And I think that the U.S. context of race is very different than what I've been presenting today in Uganda. And I think also for me, having grown up in the US and then spending a lot of time in East Africa, it took me a long time to understand the particular contextualized histories and local specificities, questions of race, ethnicity, culture, difference, and how they're operating and playing out in different ways, right? But then there's also some parallels that you can draw from. I think that and I'm sure that you're experiencing this as well as an African in the US, kind of encountering race and racialization and racial categories in a very different way, possibly than you have in Uganda. And you also mentioned that in East Africa, we oftentimes don't talk about race in that way. Like I said in my presentation, a lot of it has to do with the aftermath of the whole context of decolonization, which established kind of indigeneity, right, as citizenship, right? And then also kind of the effects of African knowledge production and the making of the ethnicity paradigm, which evacuated race from our analysis of African studies. So Africa became a place to study sort of ethnic violence or ethnic conflict, but not situated in a broader global context of racial hierarchies and racial difference, right? And that has happened, that's very common in non-settler colonies. In Uganda, I noticed it was very common, you know, in the scholarship that I looked at, pretty much everything up to 1972 and the expulsion, there was a discussion on race. It was framed more around race relations, so it wasn't that helpful, but it was there. But then after 72, you really didn't see much about race anymore. And you really kind of saw the ethnicity paradigm. Another way to think about it is that like ethnicity and race are on a continuum. So I almost thinking about ethno-racial identities is oftentimes a little bit more useful, and I try to address that in the introduction of my book as well, because colonization involved, you know, we talk about racialization and nativization, but nativization required racialization. So both those processes of racialization and ethnicization, they are part of a kind of a project of race, a racial project, we can say. So they're actually very tied together. They're sort of on a continuum. But you know, for me, the political my kind of personal and political imperative of the book is to come back to that discussion of race and Afro-Asian relationalities, and to kind of be able to make that legible and center these questions of decolonization once again, and to say, just because the expulsion happened, it's not that it's not relevant anymore. It continues to be relevant. And these are questions we have to learn from what happened in the past and see if we can take anything from those past experiences and kind of rework possibilities for the future. So I'm not an Afro-pessimist in that sense. I like to keep thinking about possibility and keeping possibility open. So your question about publics and community, I think that's really important. I think a lot of our work as academics and scholars is that we have to do this really difficult scholarly and analytical work and research work that is, you know, requires using our brain in a certain way to kind of understand what are the processes at play. And we also have to figure out like, what are the questions that we want to ask through that process, right? But then I think we require using another part of our brain when we work with communities and with publics. In my position now here at UCI, I'm doing a lot of that work with, in my position as in a chair position in Sikh studies, where I'm working with local communities. And I kind of think of myself as a connector between the university and these various publics and community actors. In the context of this project, I do have another book chapter where I talk about the kind of work that I did when I was at Makerere, where we were doing a number of these public forums to try and talk about the expulsion once again in Uganda and to kind of create a public discussion around it. I would say that it was very, very difficult to have a lot of these conversations because of the context of political repression in Uganda and the kind of fear and anxiety people have about attracting attention to themselves as returnees or as new migrants or as new businessmen. This is within the South Asian community. It was oftentimes very difficult to have those conversations, but it was kind of about starting small with one-on-one conversations and then building to smaller groups. And then we worked our way up to having these like public forums, right? And I think that part of the work that we do is we try to break down these concepts. So when I was working with the youth in particular, a lot of the South Asian, African Asian identifying youth, you know, in their common sense, like, yeah, race is race, right? Like, you're an Asian, you're an African, it's very clear cut, like what those boundaries and what those distinctions are. But you would start to break those things down even more, right? And so we would talk about things like racial stereotyping and how does that work? And like, what are the different associations that are attached to each racial group and why are they there? What happens when those stereotypes become attached to a group of people? Does it deprive them of their humanity? And if so, why? We talked about the kind of really complex identities that people across those two groups have. Can Africans identify with Indianness, with South Asianness? Can Indians identify with Africanness? You know, clearly, yes, there was a lot of complexity in identity. And once you got people really thinking about it, then it made sense to them. So I think, you know, ultimately we do want to dismantle race. Race is an oppressive system, but we can also think about how do we organize along lines of race and racial solidarities, right? That's where I think projects of Pan-Africanism and Afro-Asian solidarities become really important. Or even things like Black Lives Matter, right, in the US. So ultimately we want to get to the point where we dismantle race, but until we're not there yet. So we use the languages that are available to us to make the kind of political claims and stakes that we need to make. Does that help?
Sure.
Oops, you're muted.
Oh, okay. You hear me now? There's a question from one of the attendees. And it says, thank you for this amazing talk that offered analysis and information that I did not know about, and that really helps me think more about many works of art and fiction I have read by contemporary Ugandan and other African writers. My question is whether or not you draw from this realm in your work. Isn't it also possible that the Afro-Asian solidarities and understanding of the citizenship you flesh out is also present in Ugandan fictions that signify and speak back and forth with other African fictions? In other words, how, for example, the work of Jennifer Nansubga Makumbi, author of Chintu, links to Achebe's novels and also Bessie Hades. Isn't that a site of the Afro-Asian citizenship? Makumbi recently said, as a child, I was aware of Asians killing themselves during the expulsion, throwing themselves into the source of the Nile. People thought they could just go back to India, but they were born in Uganda and it was their home. A lot of Asians were brought to Kenya and Uganda to work as finance. That's the end of the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. We clearly have a literary scholar in the audience. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually think that the literary archive on the whole East African experience is incredibly exciting and in fact more forward thinking than a lot of the actual like social science or even some of the other humanities scholarship. And definitely I look to literature as having an intimate relationship with anthropology, and I often find that anthropological frameworks can be somewhat still limited in their theoretical framing for being able to capture some of these very thick histories, connections, and lived experiences that I'm trying to draw out when I'm talking about Afro-Asian relationalities in these broader temporalities and spatialities, and the ways in which that they still persist and exist despite the temporality of the nation state, or what I call the, the secular liberal national formation. And I haven't read Chintu yet. It's on my list. I have the book. There's a few other novels that I'm really looking forward to reading. I did a lot of reading of novels for my training and when I was living in Uganda and East Africa, and I've read quite a bit of it, the literature that emerged from the actual expulsion, the 1972 Asian expulsion. And I found those, you know, I think there's fictional writing and there's novels, and then there's also the nonfiction autobiographical memoirs, and both of them have been really, really helpful in terms of thinking about all of these ideas of identity, subjectivity, of the limitations of national citizenship and the construction of nation state identities, citizenship identities in the post-colonial African context. So I've used those novels and memoirs that were written in that immediate post-1970s period. But I think that there's a really exciting wave of new literature by younger authors emerging, especially by young Ugandans who actually, you know, maybe they were born after the Idi Amin period and they grew up in the Museveni era, and they have, you know, they're kind of like the post-memory generation, but they're actually going back and writing about these periods of time. And they have really interesting apprehensions about Indian presence in the nation and thinking about the expulsion and military dictatorship in different ways than the generation that experienced it. And also I would say that younger generations of Ugandans have like very different ideas, and they have very different kinds of urban interactions with young South Asian youth. And they're also thinking about these issues with the older generation. So there was a young Ugandan woman lawyer who used to come by Makerere when me and Jacqueline were there. And she was actually working with some of the South Asian organizations in Kampala. And she was saying, you know, my parents don't like it when, you know, if I ask to invite an Asian friend over to my house because they have some of these biases from the Idi Amin period. But I just tell them, you know, us young people, we don't have those same kind of attitudes, right? So there's a lot happening. There hasn't been a lot of research, unfortunately, since the expulsion on a lot of these issues. But I think we need more work. I mean, I often feel like there's so much work to be done on Uganda's post-colonial context and even contemporary ethnographic work. I would love to brainstorm ideas for collaborative research because there's only so much you can do as an individual researcher. And so I think it's time to start kind of thinking about new kinds of research methodologies, but also possibly interdisciplinary research methodologies. So what could literature, the literary archive, and then maybe the ethnographic archive do together? And maybe, you know, the historians also use their own kind of archives and toolkits as well. So there's a lot of possibility there. That's a great question. Thank you.
All right. That concludes.
Hand over to Rachel. Thank you, Anneeth. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so that concludes today's webinar. And Dr. Hundle, thank you for joining us today. We really, truly enjoyed your presentation. It was very informative. I also want to thank Jackie for inviting Dr. Hundle to join us and organizing today's event and leading the Q&A discussion. I also want to thank our attendees for joining us today. We hope that you join us for future webinars. We have 2 ongoing series. We have a webinar tomorrow at 3 p.m. Central Time with Dr. Flavia Rios. She'll be talking about Black politics and Black history in Brazil. We also have a webinar next Friday, November 6th, with Dr. Jason W. Moore. He will present on climate, class, and colonialism in the making of the planetary crisis. And Dr. Monique Liston will also be joining us on November 19th. She will be discussing how to combat systemic racism and sexism through Black activism in Milwaukee, followed by a webinar on December 3rd with Douglas Belchior, who is a Black activist in Brazil. So again, please be sure to check out our virtual events calendar on our department's website and for details and registration. And thank you again to all who joined, and thank you especially to you, Dr. Hundle.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here. I wish that we could keep talking, but unfortunately time is running out. I'm happy to answer any more questions and to continue the conversation anytime. And I definitely hope that someday I'll be able to visit all of you on campus and connect with the students in Africology now also.
Okay.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you,
Rachel.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Signing out. Thank you. Stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.